rigor. What's going on now? What does President Obama Bush, because educationally there's no real difference, except that Obama has intensified the incredibly counterproductive stuff that Bush began beyond what the right-wingers around Bush ever dreamed possible. But what does the president talk about? What's the purpose of schools? Why are we doing all of this? Why do we need to have higher test scores? Why do we need to have more rigor? Why do we need to have more standards that now are going to be one size fits all on a national level? Why? What is every speech by every politician and every business group saying the whole point of education is? Is it about building a thriving democracy? Never. Never hear about that. Is it about helping each child to reach his or her potential as a human being and a learner? No! It's about corporate profits. It's about making sure that our corporations can triumph over their counterparts in other countries. That's why all you hear about from Obama in every single speech on education is the STEM subjects. Not because he believes that science and mathematics are intrinsically more valuable than the study of literature or history, but because you can measure it and connect it to dollars. And all of our schools are really thought of by every person who talks about school reform. Merit pay, undermining tenure protections, more tests to evaluate teachers and students, taking money from regular public schools and giving them to quasi-private charters. Every aspect of school reform makes perfect sense when you realize the purpose of school reform has to do with economics, not education and not child development. It all clicks. And so if we're willing to question that and stand for the children in the way an organization by that name is clearly not doing, then what we have to do becomes clearer in terms of the practical implications of this. But it challenges the ideology. Project-based learning at its best is the opposite of back-to-basics garbage, where everything is done sequentially, everything is fragmented. What we need are controversial and complex, what's the term Herbert Simon came up with? I found it so lovely. Ill-structured problems. Well-structured problems are the kind you get in most standardized tests and in most classrooms. The kind where you know how to solve them, you're given an algorithm, and you just set about, and it's clear what's the right answer. Most problems in real life are not like that. Ill-structured problems. Not trying to get the right answer, because sometimes it's not clear what the right answer is. And sometimes, well, the right answer approach doesn't ask much of us. An educator I really like named Eleanor Duckworth at Harvard said, "Knowing the right answer requires no decisions, carries no risks, and makes no demands. It is automatic, it is thoughtless." She adds, when children's ideas, rather than being taken seriously, are, quote, simply scanned for correspondence to what the teacher wants, well, it isn't too hard to figure out, quote, what happens to children's curiosity and resourcefulness later in their childhood. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying there never are right answers. I'm not offering some sort of parody of West Coast relativism. Well, if you think 7 and 3 are 11, then that works for you and it's valid, okay? That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that even in mathematics, even in elementary school, let alone high school and university mathematics, most of the time is spent thinking about the concepts and becoming mathematical thinkers. Most math taught in high schools offers to students exercises that don't deserve to be called problems. They're not really problems, and there's no mathematical thinking involved. It's a step-by-step, here's the algorithm, here's the trick, here's how you reorganize the variables, here's how you solve the binomial equation, here's what you do when there are two variables, now you go and do this 50 more times. And some students are good at this, but end up not particularly enjoying it or understanding what math is really about. And other students aren't good at it or just hate it so much that they leave, check out, tune out, burn out, drop out. And that's just math, where there are right answers, let alone in other disciplines where we just pretend there are. And you're supposed to organize history, and it's mostly about... I wish when I was teaching high school English, which I did for a while, that I had asked a lot fewer questions that have a right answer. I actually had the kids memorize the definition between a simile and a metaphor. You know what the correct answer to that is? Who cares? That's an arbitrary definition. Now, metaphors per se, I find extraordinary and compelling. I'll go on, I'll rhapsodize till you think my mental health is at issue here about metaphors. I find metaphors a rebellion against the given life as we're presented with it, where we ourselves take the shovels and dig underneath the layer of the literature or the actual, but there's no right answer to what's the metaphor in this text. The more focused you are on right answers, which you are almost required to be by the standards and testing juggernaut that has our schools in its grip, the lower the quality of the learning. That's what we're challenging here. If you're not making people nervous in your community, you're not doing project-based learning right. But you have to educate them so they turn their nervousness into excitement. So they begin to say, my God, why didn't I get this kind of education? And if they want to know what your standardized test scores are, that just tells you how much more work you have to do, because standardized tests are so measures of traditional education and useless as measures for the stuff that matters. In fact, we have research, I don't know if you know this, there's research showing that even in non-project-based schools, even in traditional schools, there is actually a statistically significant negative correlation between student scores on a variety of standardized tests and the depth of their thinking. It's not a perfect negative 1.0. Of course, there are some kids who are deep thinkers and they also do really good on the test. And there's some, except in grammar, where they would know to say really well on the test. And there are some kids who are superficial thinkers and they don't do well at all on the test. But in general, according to the research, if all you know about this kid is he gets a high score on a standardized test, and you're a gambling person, you would gamble on a shallow approach to ideas. Because the high-scoring kids are typically the ones who will guess well, who know the art of psyching out the test designers. They're good test takers. That doesn't mean they're good thinkers. They're often bad thinkers, or at least lazy thinkers, because they've been led to try to figure out what the right answer is. A lot of students, I mean, do you not know, if you're a teacher, do you not know a lot of kids who you know are really impressive thinkers? They are truly creative and innovative. You admire how their minds work, but they just don't do well on tests. Raise your hand if you know a bunch of kids like that. Let me ask you the reverse. Do you know kids where you're not so sure about how much is really upstairs, but boy, are they good at taking these tests and they get good scores? Raise your hand if you know those kids. You put those two groups together, you may have a majority. Standardized tests simultaneously overestimate and underestimate. So why would you ever measure your success as a school based on tests? They're not just pointless. They're not just a measure of socioeconomic status, though boy, that is primarily what they are. Standardized tests are excellent measures of the size of the houses near your school. I'm saying the news is worse. High test scores may be a bad sign. High standardized test scores are nothing to be proud of. And low test scores are nothing to be ashamed of, which is why we have to make sure that that never becomes our externally advertised or our internally driving criterion for how well we're doing. But again, that challenges the status quo. There's two other pieces of ideology that you're going to be challenging if you take what I'm talking about seriously. I want to linger on the last one and then use that to goose you on two other issues that are related. The second piece of ideology that is challenged if you're doing this right is the fact, gets back to my elementary school teacher. I want to see what you can do, not what your neighbor can do. Without even thinking about it, because it comes so naturally to us in this culture, we tend to oscillate between an extreme individualism about making sure that we give assignments and assessments to each kid all by him or herself. And we strand kids on separate desks, strictly limiting the interaction they can have with the people sitting around them. Or, worse, our ideology is about defeating other people. It's not even just about an individualistic model, it's about victory. Your goal is to triumph over the kids around you. From the earliest days in elementary school, the race to be called on first, before the kids are too cool to raise their hand all the way. To the stickers and stars, until we get to high schools where they actually not only grade students, but grade on a curve so that the number of top grades are artificially limited. No matter how well you all do, you can't all get the top grade, which is, I don't know another word for it, immoral. Or to rank the students' grades. So the goal is not merely to get better grades, put aside learning. The goal is to step on the faces of my friends and peers, destroying any possible sense of a caring community, which is so critical for real learning to take place. A lot of kids don't know really what it means to interact in well-functioning groups, because they've been told that if they share what they know with the kids around them, that's something we call cheating. The words give us away. If we do talk about cooperation in American education, we use the word in this perverted way, where it really means obedience, as in, I want you all to cooperate now, which means do exactly what you're told. It's the equivalent of the team player in the workplace, which has nothing to do with well-functioning teams and everything to do with mindless conformity. But it's in the service of beating people. Now we go back to the presidents and the Bill Gates and other people who know less than my cab driver yesterday about what learning is about, but my cab driver doesn't have billions of dollars to impose his ignorance on the rest of us with the mandate of law. I need to take a breath after that sentence. The people who know something about how learning really happens understand that it's about what we can learn from one another. But when I made reference before toward economic goals driving the purpose of education, it's not just about dollars and cents, it's about beating other countries. It's about, and if you ever see this phrase, it's time to worry about whatever these people are going to say next. Global competitiveness in the 21st century. It's not just about economics. They're not just saying to hell with democracy and children. We just see children as future employees, which is what they're saying implicitly. They're saying it's about making sure that people who don't live in this country are always inferior to us. Think about those standardized tests that are given internationally, like PISA and TIMSS, where we get these periodic reports about, oh no, our schools suck, to use the technical psychometric term, because our test scores are, we're number 7 for 4th grade reading, we're number 13 and whatever. Think about this there are many, many problems with these rankings. Number 1, they're only as good as the standardized tests and how they're designed that lead to the rankings. So you would never cite a number like that until you were sure that those tests measure what's important. Number 2, the idea of talking about the quality of American schools makes about as much sense as talking about the quality of American air. I mean, it's the differences from place to place that drive the outcome. If you look at the rich suburbs in this country, on an international scale, they do very well, thanks very much. But it just so happens that we have a hell of a lot more poor children in this country than they have in almost any other industrialized country in the world. And as a result of that, our overall test scores don't look good. That doesn't mean we need merit pay and more rigor. It means we need to solve the poverty problem, which teachers can't do. If you look at these rankings, though, the main thing you're struck with is the whole idea of a ranking. Even if American schools didn't do as well as whatever the enemy du jour is, I don't know, Singapore or whatever, there always has to be an enemy out there, you know, for various reasons in this country. And even if the tests were good measures, what are you saying implicitly when you say that we're unhappy with our current ranking and we need to be number 1? It's as if learning was an athletic event. We're number 1 is basically the goal of all the people who point to those rankings. This says, and I don't see any other conclusion that can be inferred if that's your goal, global competitiveness even for children, is that we want children who live in other countries not to learn well. I find that view both intellectually and morally bankrupt, and it is at the heart of talk about global competitiveness. We are challenging that addiction to winning, to making sure that other people have to fail in order that we can succeed, that is present in every valedictorian honor bestowed, in every awards assembly, which is a way of making sure that some kids are set up in front of their peers as better than the peers watching. The more focused you are on winning, the less focused you are on excellence, let alone on community. But real project-based learning turns this inside out because it's about us answering our questions together. I hope most of the projects you're doing are done with groups of kids, not with individuals. Otherwise, we're not challenging that bit, we're perpetuating that bit of American ideology, which leads me to the third bit of ideology, and that is the idea of control. That some people get to decide what other people do. And the people in the underneath position are deprived of any sense of autonomy. At its best, project, problem, question-oriented learning combines choice with community to create something that most people in this culture are completely unfamiliar with: democracy, which is not about voting. Voting is adversarial majoritarianism. I'm talking about the real kind of democracy where the group has to figure out how we're going to design our project together and what we do when we can't agree. What it means to have to really listen to other people's preferences and the reasons for their preferences. What it means to forge a compromise. What it means to hash out a consensus. What it means to do what psychologists call perspective taking, which is where you imagine how the world looks from someone else's point of view. That's what happens in democratic classrooms. Having the kids vote on which thing to do is very fast, but it leaves a lot of the kids feeling even more unhappy. They expressed their preferences and were completely overridden and now are expressly being made to do what they told you they don't want to do. And all the kids, winners and losers alike, never had a chance to do real democracy with all of the social and moral growth that that entails. Real democracy. Did you come to this conference hoping to find some good project ideas? Or did you come here hoping to find the resources to go back and figure out how to help the kids find and create and construct their projects? That's a big difference. Because even the cleverest curriculum, even the best project that adults came up with unilaterally and imposed on the students is only going to be incrementally better than the traditional status quo. What the best project-based learner teachers are doing is empowering the kids so that most of the projects have been designed by the kids to respond to interests and questions of the kids. That's the difference between a first step, for which I congratulate you, and really moving towards something that is a radical challenge to the awful status quo. You want it in a bumper sticker? Kids learn to make good decisions by making decisions, not by following directions. And that's true even about the projects they work on. Do you know, I hope there are breakout sessions on this, because if I were asked to think of what breakout sessions would you have in a conference like this, one of the first ones I would think of is, how do you hold, yeah, right, I should have spoken up earlier. What does it mean to facilitate a class meeting, a democratic class meeting? You can't do what I'm talking about unless you know what it means to be other than just the traditional teacher who controls the classroom. Do you have times when you have all the kids get together, possibly in a circle so everybody can see everybody else's eyes, and talk about how school is going, and talk about what we're going to learn next, and bring kids in on sharing news, solving problems, making decisions? Even schools where they're still doing the god-awful 47-minute period. The best teachers find time they take some of that time. I watched a high school geometry teacher at an awful high school, which is to say a very typical high school. The school is too big, the classes are too big, the school is tracked up the wazoo, with some kids mostly white and affluent getting the AP and honors, and the kids of color and low income getting the basic stuff, which is it's dreadful stuff. And he's only got 50 minutes each day, and then the bell rings and you salivate and run over to history or whatever. And he has to give out grades, there's an expectation of homework, it's all the stuff we have to move beyond. And this guy said, I watched him teach for a while, and he said, I only have 50 minutes with him, but we're going to spend the first 20 or whatever it takes in a class meeting to think together about how this is going. I have to give you homework. Well, let's talk about whether we should go over the homework in our small groups or as a whole class, and why. So there's a kind of intellectual dimension to the decision making. And let's talk about how your individual and team projects are going. He's having the kids learn about geometry by making videos, by doing architecture, and getting ideas from one another. So he says, I only have 50 minutes to do this stuff, but I'm going to be a lot more productive with 30 minutes if the kids feel they want to be here, feel they're part of a community, and have something to say about what goes on the walls, how the chairs are set up, what we're going to do next, how the assessment will work. This teacher, I'm sorry to say, still gave traditional tests. We're all on a journey. But when I was there that day visiting this particular teacher, he said to them, a kid told me in between the classes while they were changing, Mr. Grove said to us, we were going to have a test a few weeks ago on Friday, and we said, we're not ready. And I listened carefully for what was to come. He said, so when do you think you will be ready? And we decided to have the test the next Wednesday. Baby steps, folks, but most of us haven't taken those. I didn't when I was teaching, I have to confess. It's a tiny thing. You're still giving tests which are lousy at assessing ideas that matter. Tests, even teacher-designed tests, are the good ways of measuring how many forgettable facts you've squished into short-term memory. You don't use tests if you're trying to assess thinking. That's not what tests are good for. Certainly not multiple-choice tests, fill-in-the-blank tests. He was still giving tests, but at least he let the kids make one tiny decision, which is when we're going to take the test. And I said to these kids, oh my God, if I went back to a bunch of teachers and said that, teachers said, when do you want to take your test? The teachers would laugh and say, oh yeah, like I'm going to ask my kids that. They would say, never. And the kids said, we would not do that to Mr. Grove. He respects us too much. And I thought, that's it. The kids who take advantage and don't respect the teacher are kids who don't feel respected by the teacher, even nice teachers, because they had nothing to say about how the furniture is arranged or where we're going to discuss the homework if we have to have homework and why, what we're going to learn next with whom, all of that stuff in a democratic classroom that gets kids juiced. The kids will take advantage, but not in a classroom where the kids have something to say about what's going on. One teacher said to me, a teacher from Ohio, my job is to be as democratic as I can stand, which I thought was interesting. Acknowledging that it's tough for the teachers sometimes, tough for the teachers to get used to giving up power. I ask you to stop for a moment and think about this. People have all kinds of rationalizations for why we don't let kids help to design the curriculum and the assessment and the rules by which we live together in the classroom. Kids aren't mature enough, they're not responsible enough, we don't have enough time, blah, 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 blah. By the way, that's analogous to the rationalizations used by politicians to deprive teachers of autonomy in making decisions. If you're at the receiving end of that kind of micromanagement and disrespect, the least you can do is turn around and treat your kids the way you want to be treated, not the way you are being treated. But the reality is that if you're used to being the king or queen of your classroom, we learn from history that monarchs don't always abdicate gracefully. We have to be willing to introspect, to ask, do I make all the decisions here because I have to? Do I make most of the decisions here about what the projects are or whether there will be grades or homework or whatever because it's in the best interest of kids learning? Or is it because I'm more comfortable? Or because I haven't been helped to shift to democracy? Or just because that's the way things have always been done? Do me a favor. We've got a limited amount of time left, but I want to ask you to do one thing right now that I hope you'll follow up on later. Think about one aspect of your teaching where if somebody pushed you, you would have to admit you've been making the decisions without even thinking about that fact. You just assume that's the way it has to be. One thing where you could give up some control to the kids. One decision. Could be a giant one. It could be a teeny one. In your teaching, any aspect of your teaching, where if you were so motivated and courageous, you could go back next year and say, we're going to decide this together. Do me a favor, take just a minute thinking to yourself about what that might be. If you want to make a note for later reference, it's up to you.